Paul Mack. I got another question from a viewer who's called Mr. Rushy. He asked this: Hey Paul Mack, how does cultivating sloped land differ from flat land? What ways can I improve my sloped land for food plots? Well, our forefather settlers, when they were looking for ideal land to want to farm, they generally they tended to like the flatter lands because it's hard to garden or plow a hillside without it washing away. A lot of folks these days, after they buy a property or buy a home, and they discover that they have the itch for homesteading and farming, but then comes the realization that the home they've purchased is on rather sloping land. You don't even have to have taken agri in high school to know that when you plow up land on a hill and then it rains, that dirt is going to wash away, which is not a good thing. And so a lot of times new homesteaders, new farmers get discouraged because they feel like, well, I don't have a good garden spot because my land is too sloping, or my backyard is a hill and I just can't garden on it. After we purchased our first property in Tennessee, and it was very hilly. It was rolling, I should say, quite rolling, and it was difficult to find a spot to even plant a 1 acre cornfield. And as I would drive along to and from work or on vacation, I like to, as I'm driving, look at other people's property and look at farms and gardens and things like that. And I would kind of have flat land envy. I would look at somebody's flat land and they weren't doing anything with it, and I thought I could plow that up and plant a bunch of stuff. And no, my land is hilly and I can't do as well. It was always kind of, a little bit discouraging that you didn't have that, flat land that you'd love to have, and maybe you're in that boat too. Back in the day, it seemed like the valuable land was the flatter land, and then the more not so well-to-do folks ended up with the hills and the leftovers. I have a close friend that he jokingly says that God created mountains so that the poor people would have something to farm. But that all that has sort of reversed these days, because now I suppose it's because the agricultural industry is now in the hands of the few, and so it's reversed in a sense, because now the more well-to-do folks want the hills and has beautiful views and so forth, which is not so conducive to farming. Sometimes you'll see folks who have flat land and they're not doing anything with it, and then others who end up buying property and wanting to homestead, they end up with a more hilly land and they're trying really hard to do something with it. But just because your land, for instance, is hilly or sloping doesn't mean that you can't put it into cultivation and garden on it, or be able to raise some food on it. There's several kind of workarounds for that. The bright side is hilly land and sloping land doesn't hold water, and that's a good thing. I mean, you can't garden in a swamp, and so it is a good thing. You just don't want all your water to leave immediately, which it'll tend to do if you don't have good practices on sloping land. A lot of people who have sloping ground or hilly ground to deal with when they're trying to garden resort to raised bed gardening in order to deal with the hills. In other words, the raised beds are just built on a slope so that the tops are even, and they compete with it that way and get around it that way, which is fine. I'm just not a big proponent of raised beds for a variety of reasons I'm not going to get into here. But the trick to gardening on a slope is to slow the water down, because, as I said, the water obviously is running off the hill as fast as it can. And if it's plowed up or tilled up, it's going to take all your good dirt with it. The trick is slowing the water down using obstacles. I use rocks and or logs, but you can also use the dirt itself. Think about this. One of the basic things you can do, it depends on how sloping your yard is, how hilly it is. My first garden many, many years ago kind of sloped in several different ways. And so when I first started out, I just made all my rows one direction. Well, in that one part of the garden where the rows went downward, all my dirt washed away downward in that section. So one of the simplest things you can do, depending on how slopey your land is, your garden is to turn your rows perpendicular to the direction of the hill. If the hill is running this way, then you turn your rows perpendicular, and your rows, in essence, become obstacles that the water has to get over, which slows the water down, which slows the erosion down. That it might be as simple as that. Another way to deal with your sloping ground, especially if your garden is not sloping all in one direction but may have some character to it, if you will, you can do what's called contour gardening. Instead of having just all straight rows, your rows can follow the line of equal elevation. Think of it this way. It's kind of an abstract concept to be able to try to describe. But think of you're trying to walk up a mountain. If you don't mind taking time to do it, you can travel kind of at an angle this way, and then back this way, and then back this way. And you're not expending so much energy. Now, you might be taking longer to get up the mountain, but you're not expending as much energy because you're trying to stay close to that line of equal elevation, because it's easier to walk across a mountain, across the side of the mountain, than it is to walk straight up. So think of that line of equal elevation, that becomes your rows. If you were to take a level and measure across let's say your mountain is this way, and you were to take a level and measure across, your row would become that equal line. And then the next row up, again, equal. Now, you will end up probably not with straight rows like is so, traditional and what everybody wants to imagine their garden being perfectly straight rows, which is aesthetically beautiful in a way. But in order to fight the sloping nature of your ground, you can make your rows contour. Now, if you follow that line of equal elevation, your rows may not be equidistant apart either, because if it slopes a certain way here, and then by the end the slope changes some, your rows might be further apart or closer together, depending on how much that slope is. But again, it's just simply you're trying to slow the water down. To try that in your garden, what you might want to do is find the midpoint that's halfway down your inclined garden area, and then take a rope or a garden hose and stretch it from side to side across that incline, and just take as big a level, as wide a level as you can find, and then you can just find that equal line across that point and mark it with stakes or whatever. And do that again several feet away, mark it with stakes and several feet away, and then you'll kind of get an idea of what your rows would look like contoured on your garden. This is not really a brand new idea. In the early part of the 20th century, around the 30s, give or take, the USDA was, and some of the bulletins talked about terracing. It became popular then, it wasn't invented then either. It was older than that. But in the 30s, it became popular with United States agriculture again, because they realized, especially after the Dust Bowl, a lot of farmers had lost a lot of their good topsoil. And so they were making efforts to save that topsoil. And one of the things they began writing pamphlets about and spreading the word about was terracing your cropland. My grandfather, Paul Mack, the original Paul Mack, he terraced his land, his 40 acres that I grew up on. And when I was a kid, I remember riding my bicycle over those old terraces. You can still see evidence of them there. When I was a teenager, riding my three-wheeler over those terraces and trying to jump them, or forgetting they were there when the grass was high and then accidentally almost having a wreck. But you can still see evidence of those terraces. And I remember my daddy telling me about how Paul Mack would build his terraces. He would take a long board, maybe about 10, 12 foot long, and two shorter boards, maybe 18 inches to 2 feet long. He would nail those shorter boards to the end of the long board, And one of those shorter boards would be slightly shorter, a certain amount shorter than the other board, because the idea back then was you didn't want your terraces on a line of equal level. You wanted them slightly off equal so that the water would hit that terrace like a long hill, would hit that terrace and run one direction. They didn't want the terraces to catch and hold the water. They just wanted the terraces to slow down the water. So when he had one leg shorter than the other and he put a level on top of that board, he would just set it on the ground and then move the shorter board back toward the hill slightly until you saw level. And then he would put a marker there, and then he would take this end of the board and then set it where the marker was and go further on down. He's finding where the terrace is going to run. And he would do the same thing. He would move that shorter board back to the hill until he saw level on the level, and then he would mark that one and then do the same thing again over and over. And so basically you're just you're marking where your terrace is going to go. And then with mules, back then, they would plow over and build the terrace until you had the hill. And the terraces were not as short as I'm talking about here. They were pretty wide. They could be several feet wide. And they would plant on the terraces as well. You just didn't want to, you didn't want your novice son with a mule messing them up or digging them up or cutting a hole in them. So whoever plowed those terraces had to take care that they preserved that shape of the hill as they planted that crop and as they took care of that crop. But here in my garden, I use, to slow down the water, first of all, in the main section, I've taken a lot of rocks that are in the garden. There's nothing else to do with them. And I've built a small retaining wall, I guess you could say, and that's the first obstacle that the water runs into to kind of keep the water there. One part of my garden is kind of flat, and then it kind of starts to slope here. The rock wall is here, and then on down I'd take cedar stakes that I would make, short stakes, sharpen one end, drive them in the ground, and if I had a pine log, a tree that was too crooked to use for firewood, or was already dead out there and it was, still had it enough together that it wouldn't crumble, I could take that log and drag it up here, skid it up here, and roll it in place against those stakes, and the stakes just held it in place so it wouldn't roll down that hill. You could do it with firewood if you want. You could do it with hardwoods. You can do it with pines. The pines are going to rot, but that's just adding materials to the soil, the microorganisms and things. So it's all good. This is kind of the neat part. Over time, as you begin tilling up, the rows in between, and mine are, I don't remember, about maybe 8 or 9 foot apart, and you've got, next to the log uphill, I keep a little space to walk in, and then I till up everything else downhill to the next log. And the neat thing about this is that after you do this it doesn't take long, maybe a season or 2 or 3, you'll begin seeing that the ground between those logs begins to terrace itself. Because a lot of people, when they think about terracing, they think, oh man, that's a lot of dirt to have to haul. But no, you don't have to do that. Just run your logs against the stakes, however many feet down, a line of equidistance, or if you want a little bit of runoff to allow, like the old terrace system, you could. But just run your logs parallel with one another down the hill, about 8 foot apart, and begin tilling up, the 4, 5, 6 foot in between the logs, and planting stuff there. And you will watch that dirt, as it rains, that dirt will wash a little bit against the next downhill log, and over time it'll be more flat, and then you'll have a drop down to the next one, and it'll kind of even itself with the top of the next log, and on down. It's really kind of neat to do and kind of neat to watch, and you don't have to spend days with a wheelbarrow dragging dirt in and hauling dirt in. You're making the dirt where it is on that hill better, and you're making those terraces. And when eventually the logs will rot. It's fact of life, fact of nature. Eventually when they rot, just, go get you a new pole somewhere, go out, find a dead tree or just whatever, and it'll last you another, depending on if it's pine or hardwood, it'll last you another few years. And even while it's rotting, I've got some out here that probably could stand to be replaced, but even while they're rotting, they'll still hold some dirt. And then it's not a big deal to, when you're finally time to put a new pole in, pull the stakes up, kind of shovel some of that dirt over, get it out of the way slightly, roll your new log in place, put your new stakes down, and keep on going. So it's not hard to do at all. The bottom line is, don't be discouraged about your sloping yard, your sloping ground, your sloping garden. There are ways around it. You can battle this, and you can come up with one of the most beautiful gardens anybody has ever seen on the side of a hill. I have a really good friend of mine who for a while lived in kind of the middle of town, and he had the most hilly backyard you have ever seen. I mean, we're not talking about a gentle slope, we're talking about a hill. And he had that hilly half acre, and it was so beautifully done, and he had the richest dirt. I remember, I think it was in November that I visited him one time and took some pictures of his garden, and he was still pulling things out of it, which is a trick to do around here. It was the vegetables were so green, and one of his tricks was earthworms. People would bring him newspapers and leaves. It's like the whole town would bring him newspapers and leaves, and he would mulch those. He would actually put the leaves on his garden and mulch his garden directly. Sheet mulching is what that's called. And even in November, I mean, I could reach down and part that beautiful black dirt, and it was just working alive with worms in November, which is a rare thing. You can do that too. If you have a hilly yard or a hilly garden, you can sure do that too. It just takes a little bit of patience and a little bit of effort and a little bit of these principles, and you can be pulling those green vegetables out in November and December. So don't be discouraged about your sloping property, because you can garden very well on it. Now, if you have something you'd like to add to today's discussion on gardening on sloping hilly ground, then please add it in the comment section below. We'd love to hear from you. Always love reading your comments. Or if you have a question about another farming topic that you'd like to bring up for another show, another question and answer show, then leave that in the comment section, and if I like it, I'll do it. So I'm Paul Mack. Until next time, I'll talk at you later. Mark Hornbaker, 5481. I use a motion sensor to power one of those wavy car lot guy things to scare deer. That flap around and gets your attention at used car lots. Oh, you mean I like it.